Good afternoon and welcome to this first webinar in a series on investing in nature. We're very pleased with the level of interest in this first webinar. We are at capacity and we'll be making a recording of this to be available for others to view who couldn't join us today. This webinar series is a collaboration between We Value Nature, the EU Business and Biodiversity Platform, and the European Investment Bank. My name is Guy Duke. I'm the Project Director for We Value Nature and a member of the consulting team supporting the EU B&B platform. I'll be moderating today's session. The organisers of this webinar today, as already mentioned, are the B&B platform, the European Investment Bank, and We Value Nature. We Value Nature is a campaign funded by the EU Research and Innovation Programme Horizon 2020, and it's working to make valuing nature the new normal for business across Europe and promote uptake in particular of the Natural Capital Protocol. It's led by the Institute of Chartered Accountants in England and Wales with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, IUCN and OPLA. The EU B&B platform provides a unique forum for dialogue and policy interface to discuss links between business and biodiversity at EU level. It was set up by the European Commission with the aim to work with and help businesses integrate natural capital and biodiversity considerations into business practice. It runs work streams on natural capital accounting, innovation and finance. The European Investment Bank is the lending arm of the European Union. It's the world's largest multilateral lender and the biggest provider of climate finance. One of the financial products that the EIB offers within the EU and in cooperation with the European Commission is the Natural Capital Finance Facility. This facility aims to invest in conservation projects applying nature-based adaptation to address the impacts of climate change. This webinar series provides practical training on how to set up a project that can attract commercial financing. This will facilitate greater investment in natural capital and biodiversity-related projects and innovations. The series is targeted at businesses developing projects and innovations in this space, but will also benefit NGOs and others seeking repayable project finance. We will host 3 webinars in 2019, and the second webinar will be held in September, October. We'll confirm the exact date in due course. Today's webinar, our first webinar, provides an introduction to financing investments in natural capital. Access to investment finance is frequently seen as a barrier by businesses in scaling up projects and innovations that benefit natural capital and biodiversity. On the other side of the table, banks and other investors struggle to develop a pipeline of investable projects that enhance natural capital and biodiversity. This webinar draws on the EIB's recent publication, Investing in Nature, Financing Conservation and Nature-Based Solutions, which provides a practical guide on how to put together investment propositions. It also draws on the EIB's experience with the Natural Capital Finance Facility in building a pipeline of natural capital projects and working together with project developers. Our presenters today for this first webinar are Stephanie Lindenberg, Coordinator of the Natural Capital Finance Facility at the European Investment Bank, and Vasco Ferreira Costa, a Senior Investment Officer at the European Investment Bank. After both presentations, we will hold a Q&A session. If you are interested in putting forward a question, please use the GoToMeeting comment box to post your questions. Please do post these questions as soon as they occur to you during the presentation, and we will be monitoring them as they come in. We'll select questions for the panelists following the presentation. All participants are muted, given the large number of participants today. However, if you do prefer to ask a question orally using your microphone, you can use the raise hand button in the GoToWebinar system. I'll now hand over to Stephanie and Vasco, who will provide their presentation.
Can everyone see my screen? Guy, can you see my screen?
I can't see your screen yet, Stephanie. I've got the GoToWebinar screen. Hold on. Yes, I can see it.
Okay, excellent. Then I assume everyone can see it. Big welcome to everyone from our side here from the European Investment Bank to this webinar series that, as Guy already said, is in partnership, it's in partnership and supported by a number of actors. We would also like to briefly mention the Natural Capital Coalition, who provides this platform to hold the webinar today, and Systemic Consultancy, who helped us to provide, who helped us developing the guide on which this webinar is actually based. So welcome everyone. Thank you very much for making the time to join the webinar. And now we would like to give you 3 webinars. 3 webinars are actually confirmed. However, we have actually 5 webinars in mind, and we hope we can do them all until the end of the year. Today's webinar will focus really on the challenges in setting up a project and how you get started on setting up a conservation project or a project involving nature-based solutions. The second webinar will look at different business models around conservation projects and nature-based solutions project. We plan to have this in September. The third one will then look at project financials, risks, and how to mitigate risks. Again, this will be held and given by 2 colleagues here from the bank who have a background in risk and project finance. The fourth webinar we are planning, hoping to be able to carry out in November, to give an overview of the different types of financing and the pros and cons that come with these different sources and types of financing that are available. And then the last that we are hoping to fit into the year before we close is an understanding on the legal structures for different kinds of projects and how to set up or identify a structure that fits the project. Very briefly about today's agenda of this webinar. First of all, we would like to give you a bit of background about ourselves, about the European Investment Bank, the institution that we work in, and the Natural Capital Finance Facility, so the instrument that Guy already mentioned, and the instrument from which we actually draw the experience of working with projects that try to invest into conservation and nature-based solutions. We will quickly speak about the objectives. What are the objectives of this webinar? Check whether it's actually relevant for you. Highlight, but probably most of them are known to all of us, and the challenges of setting up a conservation project. And then setting out the steps that are needed to develop a business case. So first of all, very briefly about us. Vaško and myself, we work at the European Investment Bank. And as I already said, on the Natural Capital Finance Facility. Now I would briefly like to give the word to Vaško to present himself and to give a bit of background on what he works on here in the bank.
We seem to be having some difficulty hearing Vaško, Stephanie.
Okay. You cannot hear him at all?
No, we can't hear him at all.
We are connected from 2 different computers.
I possibly have to make Vaško then the presenter, in which case you'll go to mute and I'm not sure we'll see your screen, Stephanie.
Ah, okay. Then I will briefly hand over my headset. It will make things a bit more tricky than we assumed, but I'll give him my headset and then swap back to me.
Thank you. Do you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, great. So good afternoon, everybody. So my name is Vasco Freire Costa. I'm currently working in the Natural Capital Financing Facility mandate in the IB, deploying investments under this facility. I'm part of the Environmental Funds and Climate Finance Policy Unit of the bank. I'm being with the IB group for more than 10 years, in different roles, including risk management in microfinance and securitization, or leading financing operations with banks, corporates, municipalities, or private equity environmental funds. I hand over back to Stephanie.
Yes, back to me, myself. I'm a coordinator on the Natural Capital Finance Facility. I work within the Environment, Climate and Social team of the bank. I've been here for more than 5 years, and yes, work closely together with Vasco. Very briefly on the Natural Capital Finance Facility. So the financing product that we offer for investments into conservation and nature-based solutions. So projects that are expected to have a positive impact, mainly on biodiversity. It's one of the first financial instruments worldwide that targets this type of investments. It's a joint initiative from the European Commission and the European Investment Bank, and the European Investment Bank manages this instrument. We are currently in a pilot phase, which runs still until the end of 2021. So if you have an interesting project or a project that you think that fits and requires financing, we are very interested to hear of you. What the instrument offers is repayable financing, debt or equity, and non-reversible technical assistance. We can finance projects that are 5 million or bigger, or require an investment volume of 5 million euros or bigger, and we can contribute a maximum of 15 million to a project, and we can finance always not the total project, but up to 75% of the project costs of your project. As we know that these are relatively new projects, we also have a budget for technical assistance, and we can support each project with up to 1 million in technical assistance to develop the project, to support the implementation of the project, and then to do monitoring and evaluating the impact of the project. The specific terms and conditions, often we are asked, so what is your interest rate? We cannot give you this without knowing your project. This only becomes clear after discussions with you and a due diligence process, and they very much depend on the specific project that you bring to the bank. For more information, you can click here or just look us up on the internet. You type in European Investment Bank and Natural Capital Finance Facility, and you'll easily find us. The reason why we mention this product that we both work on is because, as I already said, a lot of the experience that we have in trying to invest into conservation, biodiversity, and nature-based solution projects comes from working on this instrument for the last couple of years. Very briefly about the objective of this webinar. First of all, the series, it's really to develop an understanding on the side of project developers who want to invest in such projects, what an investor is looking for, and to understand what it takes to set up a project that can attract financing from the European Investment Bank or from any other commercial financing institution. Today's webinar is really focusing on how to get started, what are the first steps to develop a business case and to approach a financing institution. As we said, it's really based on our experience. We just provide you, we do not tell you in detail how to do, for example, a market analysis or how to write a business plan. We just want to highlight the key aspects that you need to think of to to get started and that you need to consider before you approach a financing institution for financing. And obviously this is really very much based on our experience, and there are probably other financiers out there that approach it slightly differently. The question whether this is relevant to you, so for whom is this webinar thought? It's so we are addressing ourselves, and also the Natural Capital Finance Facility addresses itself to either businesses, entrepreneurs that actually want to widen their scope of activity and are looking to how they can actually also invest into nature conservation or nature-based solution, how they can use it and integrate it in their webinar, in their business activities. We are addressing very much, and I think this will be one of our, or I could imagine this is one of our core audiences today, conservation organizations, NGOs, foundations that want to move away from depending on grants to seeing whether they can actually put their business on a commercial footing and identify a business model. It could also potentially address corporations that look to offset environmental impacts, financial institutions that look to working together with us. Often we work with local or regional banks to whom we lend, and they then on-lend to smaller projects, smaller than 5 million, that we cannot reach from where we are. Also, fund managers are addressed. So if you're a fund manager raising capital for conservation or biodiversity projects in Europe, the webinar could be interesting for you. And finally, one area that, or one counterpart that we are working with are municipalities, cities throughout Europe that are interested in how to make their city greener and how to probably get private financing for their green infrastructure project in their city. And now we actually move on to briefly identifying the challenges, the main challenges, and we have divided this between the challenges from our perspective and the challenges as we see it from the perspective of a project developer or investee. And now I'm passing quickly on the microphone to Vasko.
Vasco speaking. Sorry for this inconvenience, but you need to swap microphones. So what we are going to tell you is also based, as Stephanie mentioned, on our experience of deploying the facility in NCFF over the last 4 years. So what we have seen until now and in this market is that from the funding provider, so the investor in our case, we often see promoters with lacking capacity of both conservation and able to monetize conservation benefits. Basically, having the two skills together is not that obvious, and it doesn't happen often. Business plans or plans with or projects with the difficulties to generate a stable revenue stream, which is really a problem as well for investors, or at least for the ones that are financing at commercial terms. And then small transactions with high transaction costs and limited scalability. We see often weak credit profiles, mostly as startups or very small type of let's say profiles in terms of institutions, and with the small operational infrastructure supporting the operations. We also see a lack of regulatory incentives in supporting growth in this market, at least at the bankable terms, which we hope that will be developed in the future. From the investee perspective, I think what we see as well is they lack, most of the times they lack the knowledge about investor needs, and again, as we see as well, the difficulty to see how to monetize good ideas, conservation benefits. There is high due diligence costs associated to to investors, let's say, to the investors due diligence, and mostly to sophisticated ones, requires a lot of information, and this sometimes the entities are not able to cope with those requirements. And also from the risk perspective, the lack of collateral or guarantees or risking instruments that will support the business plan and the financing at commercial terms. There is also reliance on grants, and sometimes we see little incentives to create bankable conservation projects. This is probably a black picture, but in reality is what we are seeing over time with this experience with NSFF. And you are here to help to develop the market, but it's true that we receive a lot of cases that are not at all bankable. Okay, so the next slide is about what we consider as being the main steps. What are the main steps basically to develop a bankable case, and at least from the funders and the financing perspective. We believe that before engaging with the potential investors and financial institutions, the promoter should go through let's say a thinking cycle about their project that would include a certain number of steps that we are highlighting here. Again, this is not a scientific way of doing projects, it's just a guidance, and there is very good ways of doing projects using also complementary steps, let's say, but that's basically what we see as the minimum to go through a business plan and to go through a business model, let's say, to create a bankable business model. We believe that you should first understand with your audience and potential funding providers to get informed about their own due diligence requirements. Sometimes you will be able to find those in their websites, and then having that in mind to develop your business case with knowing what was the market and what are the requirements and constraints as well. So again, this is inspired on our experience and also on this Investing Nature publication. Today, we're going to mention we're going to develop a bit further the first two steps, and then we will come later in the future webinars to explore the underlyings of the next steps. So as mentioned, having a good understanding about who is out there, what is your target audience, and what are my funding provider needs is important to as well to have in mind when you develop a business plan. Very quickly. So in terms of commercial funding, I think probably everybody knows this, but from the commercial funding, usually you can get funding from either public development banks like EIB or KfW, or then private institutions like other banks or equity funds. Again, the requirements on this type of institutions are different, and we're going to check a bit. We're going to talk a bit about this a bit later. But basically, the commercial funding, and then you have two types of let's say financing. One is the what we call direct financing. So projects can be financed directly, either with equity, either with debt, or then these, let's say, more public type of institutions, they use sometimes the intermediated funding, which basically they lend to banks or to funds, and themselves they then choose their projects, the projects that are within the scope of on this sector. So again, when we lend, when we work with, in case of EIB, for example, when we work with intermediated financing with banks, we leave on them basically the responsibility to choose the projects and to assess the risk of the projects. When you do it on our own basis, as we do it for NSFF, then we do it directly and with our requirements. So the requirements may be different again, depending on the entity that is in the market, and this is important to know who is your target audience to structure your project. The funds, as such, it's a model so where it's exactly the same. Is the kind of what we call a delegation model. So the funds has authority to select their projects according to their criteria, investment strategy, and grant financing according to their terms. We will discuss a bit later about the pros and cons, what is behind each of these structures, and we have an extra webinar exactly for these subjects. This is just to give you a picture about what is out there. There is also what we call conceptual funding, and the IB and the NCFF has, for example, a grant component that can go along with the funding as well. There's also out there philanthropies and NGOs that can help to, depending on the stage where you are in the project, can help you basically to pay for the sunk costs of a project. Yes, basically this is an overall picture of what you should at least get a view in the market before starting going through your business plan. I would probably leave Stephanie, or okay, it's okay. So some questions that will help you to prepare for your business plan and to develop a bankable model. I think the first questions that you should answer is to try to understand. These are basically questions that will help you to answer to the investors' needs and also to structure your project. So, what is the problem that you are trying to solve? Is your project basically generating revenues or saving costs? What is your investment need? Is basically the business plan or the project is something that is just an idea or is mature enough that you can now start touching base with the investors? What are the other players in the market? Is there any other models that you get inspiration from? Can you replicate this model, or can it be replicated? And what type of financing basically is offered or gets this type of models? About impact as well, I think it's very important to understand, to have a mission, a vision, and to understand what is going to be your impact. That usually gives you a line of thinking and developing your project and be consistent over time. So to understand what you are trying to solve, what is your mission, what are your main goals, set up identifiable outcomes and impact, and then monitoring indicators for those as well. In this case, we're talking about biodiversity and conservation, so you should think about indicators on that sector, on this spectrum, let's say. This will give you a line of development over time, which is important for investors to be consistent and to not divert very much from that mission, let's say. Then we would like to give you a bit of a flavor what a typical funding provider, and again, the funding provider, depending if it's an NGO, if it's a bank, if it's a fund, may require different things or may require additional things, let's say. But this gives you a bit of an overview about what to develop a business idea and a model, what are the minimums that you need to think of. And it requires, in the basic ideas, you need to develop a business plan that generally includes an executive summary, project description, again, the mission, the expected impact that you mentioned before, and then a market analysis for sure. This is very important. Market demand analysis. Know very well, or at least to have a very strong, I mean, we are talking about people most of the time, so having a strong team, a team that is knowledgeable, that knows what they are doing, that they are committed, that are complementary, it's important, and you should be raised, this information should be raised to investors. We'll touch more on this a bit later. Understanding what are your opportunities, but also what are your risks, the upsides and downsides, and have a proper financial analysis of your business, let's say. So we would go through these webinars into the details of these aspects, but this gives you a kind of minimum, let's say, requirements that you should think of, at least a structure that you should think of, and then you should present, and this is a different thing. You would go through the business plan, you will detail the business plan, and then you will present to investors what we call, you should present them as a pitch, as a first step, which were kind of short, direct, and elevated speech, including the key terms of your business plan. And then if they buy in the idea, they're for sure going to ask you much more details of your business plan. And you need to be then ready to go into those details. And so it's important that you do first your homework, then you present the summary of your findings of your business plan to investors in a short and direct way. And then if the investors and the funding providers buy in the idea, then they will go, they will ask you basically much more detail, and they usually have their own procedures, their own way of asking you the details. So, but at least you should be ready, having those thought through and having done this homework. Today we are going to detail a bit more the first elements of this, let's say, this framework, and then in future webinars we'll go in more details, mostly about financial analysis and the other elements. Okay, so for the next slide is about it's basically having in mind some main questions when you want to develop a bankable business case, is to understand what is the market and where the market is, and what is around, what is your opportunity to invest and to develop that business plan. So key questions include what is very basic things. What is the service or product that you're trying to sell? I mean, whatever it is. Is there any sufficient demand or willingness to pay to justify to develop a business plan around that product? Are there any other market actors that are providing similar products, or in the same market, in some geographies, or even in other geographies? What is the market size on your target geography? And what is the type of customers that you may have? Again, these are only questions that you should ask yourself and answer to get a better picture about where we're going, what we are doing, where we want to go, and what are the opportunity to invest in that product. Understanding as well the profitability and growth perspectives of the sector is important. If it's a sector that is growing, is there any regulatory incentives that provides incentives that gives the chances, that allows basically the sector to grow in the future, or would allow the sector to grow in the future? Are there any similar models or contexts in different geographies that you could serve as a template, and you could inspire yourselves to replicate? We'll mention this a bit later. This is usually, if there are the cases, what we usually, given the market is very small, and this market in particular, what we incentivize is that you get in touch with those people and you try to understand what are the main learnings that they have done and they did with that project, and try to have them in your team, or somehow work with them when you develop your project. This will basically reassure the investors and the funding providers that you are trying to learn from past experience, and you are trying to put around the table the people that are knowledgeable and have experience on this sector, on this product or geography or sector. So trying to understand as well what is the public support that is around, and how would you position yourself in the sector, and basically how do you differentiate yourself? So what is your key elements that will basically differentiate yourself from the other, if there's a competition in the market from the others? But I think on this sector the competition is not that high. So but anyway, those are questions that you need to find yourself. You need to find answers to understand how do you position yourself in the market? What does the market demand? What your main competitors, if that's the case? How can you grow, basically? You can summarize all of this in what we call a SWOT analysis, where basically you need to explain what your strengths and opportunities of the project, and then for sure identify the risks and possible mitigants. We'll have a dedicated webinar just for this in the future as well, where basically we can explain a bit better what is behind. But the market, understanding the market demand, where the market is going, where the prospectus for growth, it's key, because you will need basically to afterwards to put those prospectus in the forecast. This is related with financial forecasts that then you need to take in consideration from this first analysis. I hand over back to Stephanie for the next slide.
No, it's not for the next slide, just to give Vasco a little break, and just 1-2 things to amend on the business case and on the market analysis. Something that we really like to see is if you can bolster up your statements and your assumption with documentation. So whether it's on the demand side of the market, if you can show us, for example, ideally an off-taker agreement, or at least a mail or a letter from a company showing that they're interested in your product, that they would actually have could imagine buying it, under which circumstances, and so on. Documents that bolster and show how you actually came to the investment needs that you are stating. For the market analysis, if you have any studies that can prove that you think that this is a growing market, which are relevant for this region and area, this is also all this kind of material that can back up your plan and your assumptions is material that we are very interested in. This I just wanted to say to complement Vasco, and then I'm giving back to him to speak about the management team.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. So the next element that we find important when designing a business model, so understanding the market for sure, as we mentioned, but then having around you a strong team that will basically help you to set up your to implement your strategy. And the team means at least 2. So usually we receive proposal where you have one person that is having that has the idea, and sometimes very good ideas, but is alone, and alone usually it's very difficult to convince and to do things. So the management team, how important is it? This is again, I think everybody knows that it's a difficult market. So the management is one of the key elements that investors are going to look at. So if you trust in the management team, again, because they have experience in the sector somehow, they have done different projects in the past. They have been part of the experience in the past on this sector. They have complementary skills. This will provide, they will reassure the investors and the lenders, and that there is a feasible case, or can be a feasible case. At least the team is committed to do it. So it usually requires a multidisciplinary and multi-actor type of profiles. So what we see often is that it's difficult to link the finance world with the conservation world. So having a team that has these 2 profiles at least is a very good signal for investors, and it's very important. Then again, the track record many times is not there, because again, there are many subjects that are completely innovative, and there are not many that we can use, but at least have a team that has complementarities, have competencies on fields that are relevant for the business model, is key. Their networks, for sure, is something that we're going to look at as well. The partnerships they have in place, the operational support. Sometimes, again, as I mentioned, we have good ideas, but comes from one person without any either, let's say, colleagues or other team support, or even either without any operational support. For example, if you work in an organization, if you have a partnership with a, I don't know, with an NGO or a foundation or a bank, whatever, that can give you operational support to set up your project, that gives you at least an IT infrastructure, or I don't know, any type of infrastructure that will help you to set up the project. This is very valuable from the investors and from the lender's perspective, reduces risks and basically increase the feasibility of the project. Working together, experiencing working together, it's also considered important. And how long have you been working together? If it's the case, you know each other, you trust each other. This is something that we consider very important as well. The alignment, potential alignment of interest. So if you, what is your, how are going to be organized in terms of corporate structure? So who's doing what are the duties of each, what are the independence, governance, I mean the checks that exist in the organization, then how would you position and what are your alignment of interest to make the case viable, let's say. So these elements are for sure important elements that we would like to see, what at least we appreciate when we see a project, and are part of the due diligence questions that usually investors ask for new type of projects, and try to understand where we're going with the project, but also considering basically the people that are around, if is able to implement or not the project. Again, we are available for any questions afterwards, so feel free to ask any questions. The next slide, it's about engaging stakeholders. I think is somehow related with the team as well. You should have, and the support you should have around you, at least you need to show to investors and to lenders that you have support, and you have talk with the right people, and you have people that are committed, and may include as well public bodies, I mean general public, private organizations, NGOs. So engaging all of them helps to set up the project, helps to define the project, and will and increase the feasibility of a project and of the bankable or financing from a bank or for an investor, let's say. Stephanie, if you want to. I think we are almost approaching the end of this first webinar. I'll back to Stephanie. But again, we are available for any questions. This is just to give you a first overview about the key elements that we would explore later as well.
Yes, thank you, Vasco. Yes, as maybe just one remark on the stakeholders. As Vasco said, we are interested in seeing how you engaged with the different stakeholders, not only because it's an imperative, because nature is a common good, but also because we know that projects who actually really involve a wide variety of stakeholders become better projects. We're working on a city project at the moment, and we see how important it is to actually work with the local residents to understand what kind of needs they have and what kind of green infrastructure is useful and helpful for them. But I think on this we are probably speaking to the converted. So it's really we are coming to an end here, and we would like to thank you all for your patience. Apologies for the technical difficulties that we had to swap the microphone each time, but we hope that you nevertheless got some interesting information or relevant information out of this webinar. And as you heard, for us, a big emphasis that we put on is on the communication between both sides, because we understand that we sometimes don't fully understand the project developers, and on the other hand, you do not understand fully what we need. So on this, I'm handing back to Guy, and we would welcome any questions. There are no stupid questions, really. Don't hesitate to ask us anything that wasn't clear or that goes beyond what we presented. Thank you all very, very much. And also a last thank you to the Natural Capital Coalition for making this webinar possible.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes.
Good. So thank you very much to Stephanie and Vasco for the presentation and for providing all that information. We'll now move into a Q&A session, and I can see we do have a number of written questions and 1 or 2 raised hands. So we'll do our best to take these in the time remaining. So I'll just pick out now for you, Stephanie and Vasco, some of the written questions and put them to you so that you can respond to those. So we've got a question here from Simon Petley, and I guess it's a question that many others might have. Many projects will require investment below 5 million euros. Is there any way to access smaller amounts?
Okay, that's a common question that we are confronted with. Again, Vasco and I will swap the microphone. I guess you can still not hear him. Vasco, can you say something to check whether it's by miracle working? Can you hear Vasco?
Not, I'm afraid.
No.
No,
okay. So we know that this is a stumbling block. The reason why our limit is 5 million is because for us, otherwise, well, we have costs for the due diligence, which are more or less the same for a small project and for a large project, and everything that is below 5 million is well, it does not work, absolutely not work for us. However, there are ways for accessing smaller amounts, mainly through intermediary banks. So the EIB works with a lot of local banks in the different European countries. And what we can do is we make a local bank an NCFF loan available, and they can then on-lend to smaller projects. We have done this for the first time in Croatia with the Croatian National Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and they are now on-lending this in Croatia.
Thank you very much for that answer.
And then maybe Vasco just highlights a very important point. We are also working with Rewilding Europe Capital. Some of you might have heard of this organization. They are based in the Netherlands, but they have project areas across Europe. And even though they are not a bank per se, they act as a bank, and we have provided them with a loan, and they on-lend to projects, conservation projects, or every kind of project that fits into the scope that we have talked about today in many areas across Europe. So Rewilding Europe Capital is probably also a good organization to talk to. They start with loans as low as, Vasco, correct me if I'm wrong, 60,000, 100,000 euros.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. Perhaps we can move on to another question here, which I think you've partly answered already. It's a question from Ernesta Machulaita, I'm not sure I pronounced that correctly, and the question is relating to how many successful projects the NCFF has currently supported, and which kinds of entities. Has it involved any cities or municipalities?
Yes, Vasco this time speaking. Yes, we have now signed 5 projects, and we have a few in the pipeline. It took a bit of time to ramp up to start developing the projects, but the market starts knowing now what we're doing in NCFF. So we have 5 projects, and in completely different areas, and one of them indeed is with the municipality, with the Athens municipality, and this is for green infrastructure. So we have signed a 5 million loan to help the Athens municipality to implement within the resilience strategy of the city and climate adaptation, the green infrastructure in the city to basically to lower the heat waves, to increase the water retention in the city, to create green corridors, to basically all the green infrastructure of the city is now being implemented through this loan, which is basically part of a bigger loan. We lent to the city 50 million loan, which basically is going to cover the other elements of urban regeneration that we usually do with our clients, mostly this type of municipalities that requires us to co-finance their investment programs for climate adaptation or resilience. That's a very concrete case, and we are just working on it. And maybe Stephanie may develop a bit further on the technical assistance. There is an angle on technical assistance on this one that could be interesting to give you an overview.
Yes, maybe just a few words on the technical assistance here that we provide to Athens. We provided them, well, they have now a team of consultants at hand to help them develop and design these projects. What we do is, as Bashko already said, the objective is to reduce the impact of heat waves, urban heat island effects, increase the infiltration of water, increase biodiversity, and they help them to design some of their redevelopment schemes in a way to integrate greening and green infrastructure as much as possible. They also help them to link different green areas in a first attempt to design something like a green corridor, and then to restore one of the landmark hills of Athens. It's called Lycabettus Hill, and to do a study on the water retention of the hill and how erosion can better controlled, and then implement the design that has been recommended by these studies.
Okay, thank you for that. We have a number of people asking whether the slides will be available. So I think the answer to that is yes, and a recording of this will be posted to the We Value Nature website and the EU BNB platform, and possibly
yes.
also to the
Short
EIB
answer is yes.
website. Yes. We've also had a number of questions coming from outside Europe. Is the NCFF available for outside Europe? I believe the answer is no.
Unfortunately, not at the moment.
Right. Then we have a question relating to the 75% investment figure you gave. Does it concern just the debt, the loan part, or also the TA part, the technical assistance grant?
It concerns, so we can finance up to 75% maximum of the project costs. The TA is something different, really. Well, normally we say we can finance or we can provide up to 10% of the project or of our loan value to the project developer. So if it's a 5 million loan, we would go up normally to 500,000 euros in TA support. However, this is an orientation. But if the project is extremely innovative and need help on certain aspects, we can also go beyond that. And maybe one last word on the technical assistant. It's not provided separate of the financing. We only provide it once we are relatively certain that the project has a good chance of going through our due diligence process and taking financing from the instrument.
Fine, okay. We have another question here from Helen Toxopius, I believe I pronounced that correctly. What's your experience with respect to how projects manage to develop enough scale for accessing finance, maybe through replication, partnering, upscaling a single project?
Okay, Vasco speaking. Maybe the case that we can use as an example is the Rewilding Europe. Rewilding Europe has expertise in conservation in different areas, by the way, and basically they are as an organization that pick up existing projects, small projects, and they try to scale them up in their way. So they have an international network of investors, and they can also replicate those projects in other areas. So they pick up different projects around Europe, and either they increase so what we call the capex and the investment, and they scale them locally, or then they replicate them in other areas. We as such are this is one of, let's say, how to scale up is examples. So you can find those examples, by the way, on their website and on our website as well. This is something that we can, this is a kind of intermediate model that we lend to intermediate, and then they scale up feasible cases around Europe because they have that experience. And we have a different, so the Athens case that we just mentioned is the one that you can for sure replicate in many other cities. This is the first in European wide, but we are working to identify other cities that will be willing and need to implement a resilient strategy through green infrastructure, and this is something that is for sure very replicable, and we have all the tools to do it. We have signed recently a biodiversity offset transaction in France with CDC Biodiversity, a 5 million loan as well. Again, this is for biodiversity offsets model. And again, this is an emerging market that we are trying to support in Europe because we believe it is a tool, a complementary tool to achieve the biodiversity goals. And there are not yet many out there, but this is something that we are trying to support. Another case that we have signed as well is SLM Silver, is a forest fund in Ireland. Is with a strategy to have a continuous cover forest strategy to maximize the biodiversity benefits. Again, this is a case that you can replicate, but for the time being, we have not yet received cases that won't replicate those. But this is something that we are looking at, and we are for sure welcoming any cases that will be replicating those good cases.
Okay, thank you. We maybe just take one last question. We're down to about 3 minutes left, so we'll need a quick answer, and then we'll just say a few closing words. How much financial history? This is from Tim Polacek. How much financial history do you usually look for as a minimum when considering investments? Does the entity need to have been running for a certain amount of time?
The basic, let's say, consideration is that we need to assess if the entity that is requesting our financing is able to absorb that financing and able to repay back that financing. And to have a conclusion on that, we need to understand a certain number of elements, and one of them is what is the historical in terms of financials of that organization. If we trust that the short answer is 3 years, that's the typical request that we ask. But again, there is always on case by case. We have situations when we work with rewilding, for example, the first time was the institution was there, but it was a pretty new institution that was set up for this loan. But they had a support from the shareholder, strong shareholder. So if they have a strong support from a shareholder, for example, that gives trust to the investor or to the lender, that's also fine. But we need to assess the basic principle. We need to assess if this entity is going to be able to absorb our financing, and if it's able to repay within a certain time, that time that we usually link to the economic life of the project. So if a project that has 7-8 years of economic life, we then give that lending as well for that type of horizon. So it's on case by case, but that's basically the underlying is behind.
Thank you very much. And we're now pretty much out of time on this webinar, so it just remains for me to say thank you very much to our panelists, Stephanie and Vasco, and thanks also to the Natural Capital Coalition for providing the GoToWebinar platform for this webinar. And I'd like to thank all our webinar participants for sticking with us. I've noted that there's been a lot of stamina out there to hear us through and a very low dropout rate. So thank you for sticking with us. Just to say again, this webinar has been recorded and will be made available through our websites. You can find the links on this page here. We hope you will wish to join us for our next webinar in this series on investing in nature after the summer. We will issue details of the timing of that in due course. Thank you very much, and I think that is the end. Yes, Stephanie.
Yeah, just two words from our side. if you have more questions, burning questions that you would like to ask, you can obviously send us an email and we'll get back to you to our generic email address. You'll find it on the website. So we are happy to hear from you, and obviously also from any projects that you might want to propose. And second, that we didn't mention before, in our presentation, there's also an annex with a link to the guide, Investing in Nature, that this webinar is based on, and with more information also on the Natural Capital Finance Facility. And also from our side, a big thank you to the audience and everyone who is involved. And Guy, thanks.
You're welcome. And we are noting all the questions, and we will, those we haven't been able to answer this time around, we will come back to those in subsequent webinars. Thank you all very much, and have a good rest of the day. Thank you. Bye-bye.